Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on EMAC and the Water and Wastewater Agency Response Networks, or WARNs. Through WARNs, utilities are to help one another in other states under EMAC. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Kevin Morley. Kevin represents the American Water Works Association on the EMAC Advisory Group. The EMAC Advisory Group was established following Hurricane Katrina to engage the response and recovery personnel within the EMAC process and to identify areas for improvement. It's my hope that this is the first in a series of webinars that highlight efforts being taken by response and recovery to standardize and become a valuable asset for states under EMAC. I'll now turn the webinar over to Kevin.
Thank you, Angela, and hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this webcast. My name is Kevin Morley, and I'm the AWWA Security and Preparedness Program Manager. And as noted, I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. I think we have an extremely talented and distinguished panel of experts for today's webcast, which include Scott Kelly, Mike Sprayberry, and Captain Dave Apanian. Our first speaker, Scott Kelly, will provide us with an overview of the Water and Wastewater Agency Response Network, which is otherwise known as WARN, which has evolved over the last several years to provide an excellent capacity for response and recovery in the water sector, and a bit of the history, purpose, and the capability. Mike Sprayberry will then provide us with some perspective on the importance of partnership between state emergency management and the water sector during incident response, some of which can be observed, unfortunately, in Haiti today. Third in the lineup is Captain Dave Apanian, who will share the view from EPA's Region 4 office, which fortunately or unfortunately has had lots of experience in the past few years with a number of different natural disasters that have had direct impacts in the water sector and significantly influenced the conversation that we're having today in terms of WARN. A little bit of context for this webcast. AWWA is a member of the EMAC Advisory Council, and Scott Kelly is the representative to that council. And over the last few years, as the WARN program has evolved, we've been more involved with EMAC and trying to seek ways to collaborate and work together. More recently, and interestingly enough, a set of recommendations developed by the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, or the NIAC, issued a report last summer, which is currently under review by the White House, which includes recommendations on integrating WARN with EMAC's education and outreach programs so that we're both better aware of each other's needs and capabilities. And so in light of that recommendation, we've tried to make good on that, and working with our colleagues at EMAC, and to provide you with what I think is a very rich program for today's webcast. As noted, please go ahead and submit your questions via the tool available on your screen there, and we'll do our best to address those questions at the end of the webcast. Our panel of experts will begin to answer those questions at the end, so please be sure to include your name and city from which you're viewing the program so that we can direct them appropriately. I would add, again, a little bit more context in terms of some of the challenges and opportunities, in part, that the WARN and the water sector have experienced, and part of the reason for this educational overview of each other's needs and opportunities to work together, again, to enhance the knowledge of water sector resources and facilitate that information exchange with our peers in the emergency management community via WARN. As many of you are aware, water is a lifeline sector, and we believe it should be a priority during and following some of those life support missions. And consideration of including WARN representatives in the state EOC, either physically or virtually, to provide more enhanced communication capability to have an effective and rapid response. And again, we'll be continuing to collaborate and training and education opportunities between EMAC and WARN and each other's states to provide more effective response and recovery. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get to the heart of the program. And I'd like to turn things over to Scott Kelly, who I said, again, is going to provide a little bit of context for what WARN is, and then we'll hear from Mike and Captain David Apanian a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, WARN stands for Water Wastewater Agency Response Network. This concept started in California in 1992, and it was in response to a series of firestorms that impacted the East Bay area and actually ended up severing several water lines and causing outages in that area. After that, in 2005, FlaWARN was actually, or Florida Water Wastewater Agency Response Network, was established, and this was based on the experience of the 2004 hurricane season when 4 major hurricanes struck Florida. It became apparent that we needed to be able to copy the California WARN's model and form our own WARN. And then the big ones hit, starting with Katrina and then Rita and Wilma, battering the Gulf Coast and causing the need for mass mutual aid assistance throughout the area. FlaWARN responded to all 3 of these events, and including Katrina through interstate EMAC agreement. Once things settled down after that hurricane season, FlaWARN actually conducted a seminar in November of 2005 to bring other states and utilities in to see if we could consider forming additional WARN networks in order to be able to help facilitate response. The advantages of WARN became apparent during that 2005 hurricane season in the fact that through mutual aid assistance agreements and would provide a process for sharing emergency responses, that was very apparent that was an important aspect, and that there could be additional resources to respond and recover more quickly from disasters, as well as where utilities could share resource inventory and availability both among themselves and with their state and local emergency operations centers. In 2006, early 2006, American Water Works picked up the ball in advancing this concept and came out with what is called Utilities Helping Utilities Statement, and encouraged other organizations to join in a joint policy statement. And there were actually 8 major water organizations that encouraged the creation of interstate mutual aid and assistance networks. And the whole purpose of this was to provide greater resilience against both natural and man-made disasters. The heart of the WARN program is a mutual aid agreement, and if I could get the next slide, please. This agreement is strictly voluntary. It provides no obligation for those that there's no obligation that they have to either respond or request assistance. I think an important point is that these WARN networks, there's no cost to join, and that it allows for both public and private participation. We provide for liability and workman's compensation provisions to define that, as well as there's reimbursement processes. And I think significantly it satisfies the element of the NIMS, or National Incident Management System, objectives, and even the sector-specific goals of Homeland Security, which are to maintain a resilient infrastructure and to actually expand implementation of the mutual aid agreements in the water sector. So this satisfied those concepts. And as I mentioned, it was an all-hazards type approach. AWWA, with the help of a EPA grant, has provided a number of workshops around the country. I think just about all the states have been covered with these workshops. Starting in 2006 and 2007, the process accelerated, and these workshops have been wrapped up in 2008, and it's provided great results, as seen on the next slide. At the beginning of the process, there were only 3 WARN in April of 2006. As I mentioned before, there was Cal WARN, and then Florida WARN, and then Texas, in response to the 2005 hurricane season, formed their own WARN. And this concept has really dramatically expanded in a very short time period. In October of 2007, as shown on the next slide, there were actually 12 WARN organizations. You can see it expanding. And then in January 2008, we went to 20 WARNs. On the next slide, you can see that in October 2008, there were 31 WARNs, and finally, as recently as December 2009, we now have 45 WARNs around the country. So the bulk of the country is covered with their own mutual aid networks. So this has been a concept that's really taken hold. What's the future hold? We hope it holds, as shown on the next slide, the WARN ultimatum, which is WARN agreement signed in all states, and this would be fantastic if we were able to accomplish that. The operational framework for activation of WARN is really not been well known. So what we did is we provided some graphics shown on the next slide to be able to show how this process works. In the initial response following an emergency, typically under the WARN concept, utilities would activate agreements with neighbors or others in a local agreement. And through WARN activation, we can respond to both small emergencies or large emergencies, and it can be prior to an actual declaration, either a state or a federal declaration. WARN activation typically is for a short-term, 2 to 3 week time period, but we can actually fill the gap in longer emergencies, such as was the case in Katrina. On the next slide, you'll see that most existing statewide agreements require a declaration for use. Notice the gap before statewide mutual aid or assistance rolls in. And this is a gap that can be filled, as shown on the next slide, by the WARNs. WARNs do not require state or federal declaration. And also, I think a key feature is they can include private utilities and their resources. As depicted here, the WARN activation can start after the initial emergency and go all the way through a declaration by the governor, and even go further through the EMAC process if there's interstate mutual aid assistance required, such as was the case in Katrina. The success of WARN, as shown on the next slide, depends on coordination and communication of all partners, and WARN by themselves cannot work effectively. We need both our state and local emergency operations centers to be able to effectively manage the event and allow us to be able to be included in the communication channels. We need EMAC in those cases where interstate mutual aid assistance is required. And certainly we need our federal partners where a major disaster such as Katrina, where we would need resources from FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, etc. As you can see, WARNs can help bridge that gap in communications between the state EOCs, the local EOCs, and the utilities. And we feel like this is a critical link in this process because typically WARNs are comprised of experts in the field that are subject matter knowledgeable about how to effectively respond to water and wastewater crises. There's been many successes and opportunities since we started the WARN concept, starting, as I mentioned, with Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. But there's other types of emergencies, such as what occurred in Alamosa, Colorado. Who would have ever thought that we would have been responding to a salmonella contamination event where the system was essentially had to be shut down, the water system, which created tremendous hardship for the people in Alamosa. So WARN was called upon to respond and provide resources in order to be able to get bacteriological clearances on that system. We all know about the Midwest floods, particularly in Iowa, additional Southern California wildfires, and then, of course, the hurricane season, including Gustav and Ike that hit the Gulf Coast, and finally the ice storms that devastated Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana. Well, WARNs have responded to all those events very successfully and provided resources. Some of the major lessons learned through our WARN responses have been to be able to better define roles and responsibilities between all the various parties. And this is something that I feel why this call, this webinar, is very important in advancing that understanding of how all of the utilities, as well as the emergency operations centers and the various federal agencies, can work together in unison to be able to more effectively respond. Some of the major lessons learned, other ones were that communications and power were very difficult lessons, as well as another lesson was that self-sufficiency was of utmost importance, and that's what we're trying to get across. Something that's been very important is that we've been able to educate utilities throughout the country about the economic benefits of forming and participating in a water wastewater agency response network. And AWWA has actually provided a publication that outlines those benefits. As you can see from this slide, EMAC and WARN need to be important partners, and there's many cogs in that wheel in order to make this work if we're going to effectively provide interstate response, including, as I mentioned before, the state emergency operations centers, as well as other partners, utilities, water associations. What WARN has been able to do through American Water Works Association and other agencies has been able to establish resource typing manuals, help with operation plans, and we've actually conducted a number of exercises around the country in order to be better prepared. But I think the takeaway from this presentation is that's important that WARNs and the state EOCs, as well as the EMAC, all work together. In Florida in particular, we have representation. Our WARN has representation right in the state EOC, has a desk in the EOC that's enabled us to dramatically improve our response here in Florida. So I appreciate the opportunity to present this. I'll now turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Scott. And as folks can see there's a lot that's occurred from the field since this the WARN initiative really got itself going back in late 2005, early 2006. And I would note that Scott mentioned a number of different resources, and we've tried to do our best and collect those on a website that you can access after this call at www.nationalwarn.org. And I believe that this webcast will also be posted to the EMAC website in their archives as well. But as we keep the program moving forward here, again, I want to thank you, Scott, for your overview there. But we'd like to now move on to Mike Sprayberry, who's going to give us some perspective from a state emergency management situation and how they see WARN in supporting their activities. Mike?
Okay, thank you, Kevin. This is Mike Sprayberry from the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. Good afternoon, everyone. And before I get started, I'd like to thank Scott for an excellent presentation. And we're right in line with the way that he feels. And one point that I would like to get across before I go into my briefing is that we in North Carolina believe in the WARN concept. We believe in the EMAC concept. And we do have a desk for WARN in our EOC, and we have, of course, an EMAC desk in our EOC. So when we spin up and get activated, we want those people sitting in their chairs in front of their computers and ready to assist us as needed. I'm going to talk about a little bit about emergency management to give you a little bit of context. I think Scott gave you the angle from the Florida WARN. I'm going to give you the angle from emergency management. Our mission, quite simply, is public safety, and we try to look out for folks' lives and property. We reduce the vulnerability. We prepare for prompt and efficient rescue, provide rapid and orderly rehabilitation, and basically we are the hub here in the state of North Carolina for coordinating all state agencies, volunteer agencies, and counties that are assisting via mutual aid and the federal government. Of course, we prepare for the familiar and the expected. These are some of the things that we experience in North Carolina. Of course, we're, I think, second behind Florida for receiving hurricanes. We've been fortunate in the last few years, but we've had some big ones over the years. We just had a winter storm, and we are currently pursuing a federal disaster declaration for western North Carolina. We have tornadoes every year, and of course you see in bold and underlined, italicized, or water system failures. And, you know, I think that, you know, it's absolutely correct that without water, you really can't people can't live their lives, they can't do their missions, we can't fight fires, any number of things. So that's really a key item to have. We also dealt with a pretty severe drought here in North Carolina, and you know, that affected our water systems. We learned more about water systems than ever before. The unexpected but possible, I'll mention to you right now that currently we're number 2 on the list for the Haiti repatriation plan. So we've been spending a lot of time the last few days planning for that. They tell us that it could come in any airport. So you never know when you're going to have something coming in, but you'll see on this slide as well, infrastructure and or system failures. Again, we want to make sure that we're ready. We're not the subject matter expert or the technical lead on this. We look to our WARN partners sitting at our desk in our, we call it the Infrastructure Support Group, which includes our ESF3. They'll tell us, you know, once we receive a request, you know, what we need and help us identify the type of resource to deploy downrange and take care of the problem. Quite simply, disaster operations and emergency management's 4-tiered response. Locally centered, we all preach, you know, a disaster begins and ends at the local level. It's regionally augmented. All 101 counties in the state of North Carolina are signatories to a mutual aid contract where they can help each other out. And sometimes they'll ask for payment. A lot of times they don't. They just help each other out. If they're overwhelmed, then the state comes in. Of course, our federal partners, which we have a very good relationship with at FEMA Region 4, come in and help us as well. And this is the little diagram that shows how the disaster begins. The local emergency folks come in. Then we get the county in, and it just goes on and on through the different tiers. Okay, we have a state emergency response team, I'm sure, as most other states do. And for the infrastructure support group, these are some of the folks that we have that would report to our state EOC and sit in our infrastructure breakout room. Some states are organized by ESFs. We combine ESFs in support groups like emergency services, human services, infrastructure, etc. And as the operations chief, I do oversee those 3 services group plus aviation. So as you can see here, we have the electric membership, power companies, fuel suppliers, our environmental and natural resources, and you also see here where we have the North Carolina Water and Wastewater Assistance Resource Network, NC Water WARN, good partners. The way we have it is we sort of cherry pick who needs to come into the state EOC based on the type of event that we're having. So these 5 agencies are pretty much going to be there all the time, and dependent on the type of disaster it is, we'll ask for the others to come in, or else they can sit at their own agencies and work with us via remote. As you see there, we have DOT, Petroleum Markers, our Department of Natural Resources, Water WARN, and the State Energy Office. Just some photos of what we call infrastructure disasters in North Carolina. We frequently get a lot of storms out on our coast. We have barrier islands, and that's a couple of shots there. And our greatest risk is flooding due to hurricanes. Once our state EOC activates, what we do is we have our infrastructure support group partners report to the state EOC infrastructure breakout room. As I mentioned before, North Carolina Water WARN has a seat and a computer, and we've been working with them. They have they exercise with us as well, and they're beginning to build some depth so that they don't just have to depend on 1 or 2 people. They'll be able to support us on a 24-hour basis depending on what the event calls for. The WARN representative monitors the crisis management software. In North Carolina, we use WebEOC for water and wastewater system resource requests. The WARN representative analyzes the request, and once the analysis is complete, the WARN rep contacts and coordinates with other WARN members to provide specialized type utility-to-utility support. I cannot overemphasize how impressed we were here at the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management when we attended that conference that Scott was referring to, the one that was held here in 2006 in Charlotte, and we saw a presentation where American AWWA and NC Water WARN and the WARN in general had all worked together to type their resources down specifically to the type of people that they needed to deploy, along with the types of tools and parts that they needed. I mean, in great detail. You know, NIMS compliant, and that's what we love here in North Carolina, and I'm sure that's what other states like. The ability to pick up a mission-ready package, a type package, and plug it in based on what type of infrastructure that they're going to be working on, and just let them get to work. So they have done an outstanding job, and a lot of work has gone into that. It's evident, and that's what we're trying to do with all the resources, and I know that FEMA is doing that as well. All the support is coordinated and documented through WebEOC, and that's important. Of course, like everybody else, we want to make sure nobody's self-deploying. We want to make sure that everybody has a mission number. If it's interstate, we want to make sure that all those go through EMAC. If it's intrastate, we make sure it's all coordinated by the state EOC so that nobody's surprised. And we also want to make sure that all costs are documented so that everybody can be reimbursed for all eligible expenditures. What happens if the resource is not in North Carolina? It's great. You know, WARN can work through EMAC to coordinate utility resources from WARN members in another state. And as Kevin told you, and I believe Scott as well, they told you that 45 states have a WARN agreement as of this month. And my only question is, what are the other 5 waiting on? They need to get with the program, because this can only be beneficial to you know, all emergency managers and all water and wastewater system operators. Is all the benefits that Scott went through. I mean, all I can do is just second that. Reimbursement within our state, if we are looking at deploying a WARN asset from our desk inside the infrastructure support group room, we'll deploy it as a state resource under our flag. We'll pay the utility for eligible expenses and seek reimbursement from FEMA and or the state, dependent upon whether or not it's a state declared or a federally declared disaster. WARN resources can be deployed through mutual aid. Again, I mentioned that all the counties in our state have mutual aid agreements so that counties can deploy from one local government to another local government. And as I mentioned also before, sometimes they ask for reimbursement, other times they don't, because they understand that down the road that they'll be needing help from their brothers and sisters in this business. Okay, why do we think that they're critical to the Division of Emergency Management? You know, water and wastewater services, I mean, it's self-evident. It's required for public health, fire suppression, reentry, economic stabilization. If we can minimize the recovery for these types of systems, it saves lives, money, everything. And so, I mean, it's just good business. It expedites access, WARN does, to limited and specialized resources. Myself, as an emergency manager, I wouldn't know where to go. WARN's got everything in mission-ready packages. I say again, mission-ready packages that they can deploy with just a phone call or an email. WARN saves costs for government, again, by minimizing water and wastewater services disruption. You know, works both in an intrastate and an interstate context. You know, in North Carolina, we're big believers in EMAC, big believers in mutual aid, and what better way to say it than utilities helping utilities? There's no strangers there. Okay, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
We seem to be having some trouble with audio with Kevin. I'd like to introduce, however, Captain David Apanian. He is with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Region 4, the Water Protection Division.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. As mentioned, my name is Dave Apanian. I'm a civil engineer and a captain in the Commission Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service. My current duty assignment is on detail to Environmental Protection Agency Region 4 office in Atlanta, working in the Water Protection Division. During this talk today, I will be using the term water sector. For some of you that may not have heard that before, it applies to both the drinking water infrastructures and the lumpy water infrastructures. This afternoon I'll be talking briefly about the National Response Framework, or NRF, as it applies to support for the water sector, EPA's role in supporting the water sector under the NRF, and what we in the regional office view as the importance of integrating water, utility, mutual aid networks under EMAC. I show this map here as a reminder that while policy and regulation development are coordinated through EPA's headquarters in Washington, emergency response activities are handled out of our 10 regional offices in coordination with the FEMA regional office. Region 4 is based in Atlanta and is responsible for the 8 southeastern states. When a disaster occurs, whether natural or man-made, it impacts folks in different ways. The disaster impacts the utility directly by damaging their power supplies, treatment facilities, collection systems, and other parts of their infrastructure. The disaster impacts the interdependent sectors. The loss of water supply or treatment capability certainly has an adverse impact on the hospitals, restaurants, shelters, and other sectors served by the water and wastewater utilities. And the water sector is impacted if the disaster prevents production or delivery of treatment chemicals, supplies, fuel, and power. Lastly, the disaster will have an impact on the state primacy agencies as they take on the role of leading and coordinating the state's response for their sector. I won't spend much time talking about the National Response Framework other than to emphasize that the NRF is the primary mechanism through which federal assistance is available to the water sector in response to major disasters. As you may know, the federal resources are grouped into functional areas called Emergency Support Functions, or ESFs. This slide shows the 15 ESFs of the NRF. Now, while EPA is the lead agency for hazardous materials under ESF 10, we are responsible for more than hazmat incidents. For the water sector portion of a response, EPA has designated responsibilities as a support agency under 5 ESFs, shown here in green, and can be pulled in under ESF 6 and 12 also, shown here in red. Different aspects of the water sector are scattered throughout the NRF, which can lead to some difficulty in coordination. But, as we've heard earlier today already, this illustrates the importance of the water sector and how it's essential to nearly every aspect of response and recovery activities. The NRF focuses primary support for the water and wastewater infrastructure under ESF 3, the Public Works and Engineering Annex. Now, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or USACE, is the lead agency for ESF 3, but the water sector is a small part of their overall responsibility. They have their canals, levees, rivers, debris removal, blue roofs, bottled water, and ice missions to deal with. Because of EPA's close working relationship with state primacy agencies, our day-to-day work with their programs, senior management, and in many cases with their field staff, and the fact that we know water, the Corps of Engineers has turned to EPA to help lead the federal water sector response. When the state does request federal assistance for the water sector, the request must go through FEMA. And FEMA's ability to issue mission assignments to federal agencies is enabled by the Stafford Act. It's important to note that FEMA is also limited by law in what they can do. As we've seen in the past, too many people have unrealistic expectations about the assistance FEMA can provide. FEMA cannot be everything to everybody. They are not first responders, and for the most part, neither are the federal agencies that they task. Based on experiences from past disasters, we can anticipate the types of assistance the water sector may need. From a federal standpoint, EPA anticipates that large-scale disasters that are big enough for states to ask for federal assistance, will have some typical missions under 3 broad areas of support. First, we provide support to FEMA and other federal agencies by coordinating with water sector partners at all levels and developing the situational awareness for the sector. Second, and one of the most common missions we receive, is to provide technical assistance to the state water and wastewater primacy agencies. And by technical assistance, we're mostly talking about personnel to assist the state in their management of the disaster. And finally, when utilities are severely impacted, we might be tasked to provide assistance with emergency power, treatment chemicals, supplies, storage, and emergency repairs. There's two important things to remember when talking about federal assistance at the individual utility level. First, the state has to ask for these resources through FEMA, and the federal government has very little capacity to assist individual utilities with repairs and to restore services. We don't have utility crews, backhoes, and other repair equipment. Because of the limited federal and state resources for utilities, it is critical that utilities have these mutual aid networks established. This is essential to recovery, not only for the utilities' recovery, but to the overall recovery because of the interdependencies with the other sectors, such as healthcare, sheltering, lodging, all those that depend upon a safe water supply and waste disposal. Now, resources are available to assist utilities in recovering, but getting those can often be a challenge. All disasters are local, so when the drinking water or wastewater utility experiences an emergency, they're ultimately responsible for their own recovery. When their own resources are overwhelmed, they should first turn to their mutual aid networks to get help from other utilities. There may be help available from local and county agencies, and utilities can turn to the state and request assistance through the state EOCs. And when the state's overwhelmed and runs out of resources, it is up to the state to decide whether or not they're going to ask for outside assistance, either through EMAC or federal assistance through FEMA. Now, because utilities cannot go directly to FEMA for assistance, they must go through the state EOC, and it's really important for the utilities to understand their state processes and procedures before the disaster strikes. It's also important for them to understand that there is limited federal resources, and the federal assistance is last resort when state and local resources are exhausted. The bottom line here really, by looking at the slide, is that utilities' best bet for on-the-ground assistance after a disaster is to reach out to other utilities through the mutual aid networks. And in response to large-scale disasters, the state must be prepared to utilize EMAC to reach out to utilities in other states. EPA has been a strong supporter of water sector mutual aid networks for many years, but that support really kicked into high gear after the 2005 hurricane season. The need for expanded mutual aid networks and the need to integrate within EMAC is very clear for the water sector. Working with AWWA and other partners, we sponsored workshops, conferences, developed outreach materials and tools to support local WARN networks. I won't go into their details here, but more information can be found on our website at www.epa.gov/water security. We strongly encourage the integration of WARN networks within the EMAC structure and have developed a fact sheet for our water systems entitled the EMAC Tips for the Water Sector. That's also available up on the EPA Water Security website. So while the federal government has resources that might be available to support the overall management of disasters impacting the water sector, there really is very little we can do to directly support the utilities' repair and recovery efforts. Utilities have to be prepared to utilize and support their local mutual aid networks, and when the disaster exceeds those capabilities, the state must be ready to use EMAC to access utility assistance from other states. I do really like this slide because during a catastrophic disaster, EMAC will be the key for a timely recovery by bringing in utility-to-utility assistance across state lines. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kevin.
Thank you, David, for that excellent overview and perspective from EPA and certainly the role that the utilities can play in facilitating resource exchange. And ultimately, folks, as you might be aware, I'm sure from the field that you're in, this is about getting the communities that each of us serve back in the best of normal as possible operating condition as quickly as possible so that both personal and economic conditions can get back on track. We'll go ahead and open the channels there for questions. We've received a couple. Perhaps they've been addressed through the conversation here. Go ahead and flip that last slide. As we've mentioned, obviously there are resources available through EPA's website, which is also linked We have a link to that from the nationalwarn.org website. And then this webinar will be available through the emacweb.org website and the nationalwarn.org website. I wanted to go ahead and direct a question to Scott Kelly, since he's had some direct personal experience with some of these things. Scott, could you provide perhaps a little bit of additional clarification on during an incident how a utility actually gets assistance from another utility, but simultaneously communicates that with your folks in the state EOC?
Yes, Kevin. What we're able to do is activate our WARN program, and we have communication channels we open up among the utilities. We're able to do that through conference calls as well as email communications. During this period of time, our communications actually flow through the State Emergency Operations Centers, where we have representation in the state EOC. We actually have a seat at the desk. We're in ESF 3 as well as 10, so that we can foster better communication between EPA as well as the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So our communications actually flow through the State Emergency Operations Center. We also depend upon the local utilities to provide communications through their local Emergency Operations Center, and then in turn help facilitate that communication on up through the state EOC. If federal assistance is necessary, federal resources is necessary, that's certainly an important element of the communication chain.
Great, thanks. I think one of the other questions that was raised here, based on perhaps one of the points that Mike Sprayberry addressed, and I'll take a crack at it, but certainly Mike, go ahead and jump in, was on the terms of what mutual aid and assistance activities are eligible for FEMA reimbursement, assuming that the incident becomes a declared emergency. And one of the critical things here that was one of the key stimuli for the program, and also for utilities in signing this one, again, as Scott noted, this is completely voluntary. A utility that's a signatory to an agreement is not obligated to respond, obviously, because they may have they may be under their own duress, depending on the scale of the incident in the area, or they may not have the assets or resources necessary to respond to a situation. But the key thing here is that these agreements are signed and written and in effect prior to the disaster. These are pre-established, so it minimizes the ability for some of the predatory situations that have emerged after certain events. And again, this is a peer-to-peer type network, utilities helping utilities, obviously with key partners. But that is an essential function and element for the FEMA reimbursement conditions and also some of the NIMS criteria. Mike, would you have anything to add to that?
I was just saying that, bringing the infrastructure back to pre-disaster conditions, I mean, that's an eligible expense. And so you're right, you've already got a pre-established agreement in place. It makes it neat and clean. You can demonstrate that to the federal government, and I think it's well supported.
Excellent. I guess another perspective is the folks that are involved in the WARN. Perhaps Dave, if you want to take a crack at that from your role that you've played there as an EPA regional representative to a number of different WARN programs.
I think it's worked real well in terms of the established relationships ahead of time, facilitating the reimbursement. As you mentioned, that it's a requirement under NIMS that they have these organizations and agreements in place and for federal reimbursement. There's still a lot of discussion on developing the resource typing to facilitate getting resources from spot to other, but you and AWWA and some of the folks have been working on that.
Yeah, I would mention that, again, another resource that's available through a year-long process involving some of the folks on the line here and your peers sat down and worked through, as Mike noted, these mission-type packages that could be deployed, and the thing that the sector at the utility level considering is how they as a utility can have some of these different teams or elements of these teams ready and identified within their utility so that when the request comes in for a pump station repair team, they know immediately that Jacksonville, they have a team that can be put together, and they have a sense of what that takes and what it takes to get that down to Orlando or wherever else it may be. Mike, I guess I'd like to ask one more question in terms of, in your perspective, or maybe this is back to the EMAC folks that are helping us host here. Any other questions in terms of challenges in effectuating an EMAC request should, say, the state of Georgia need some help from North Carolina in terms of critical information or key steps that we may not have touched upon here that are those points that need to be crossed and I's dotted and T's?
I think the key there is that the states are communicating with one another about what's going on and then completing the Rec A. Pretty simple process since everyone's used to doing that, but I think the communication with the WARNs within their states is the key to making it be successful.
Great, and again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Those are some of the principal questions that we've got here. Certainly feel free to contact any of us following this webcast if you'd like some follow-up. On the nationalwarn.org website, we do have the contact names for all the state WARN chairs, such as Scott Kelly. So I'd encourage the EMAC participants or the EMAC coordinators are out there to, if you haven't already made that connection, to make that connection, and certainly want to give EPA its due in supporting this initiative and being a very strong advocate, and the other associations in the sector for advocating this WARN program through the joint policy statement that Scott mentioned. AWWA just happened to be in a position to manage a grant that was able to facilitate those workshops, and it's, I think, proven through the maps that Scott provided there that this has been a bottom-up process. It's not been a top-down. The utilities have recognized the value of this program for themselves, and it's pretty much gone gangbusters since 2006 and turning the states green. And as we move forward, we are developing some additional metrics and capabilities to understand the extent and depth of the WARN program in each state in terms of the number of utilities that are signatories and the population served by those programs. So as time goes on, we'll have a better sense of the total reach and capability, and certainly we'll continue to work with our colleagues at EMAC to keep you up to date on that capability. And with that, I want to thank everybody for participating today, including our excellent panel, Scott Kelly, Mike Sprayberry, and Dave Apanian, for taking some time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to share their thoughts and perspectives. Angela?
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you to our panelists for joining us today. As a reminder, when you close the control panel, a short 5-question survey will come up on your screen. And thank you in advance for taking the time to complete that questionnaire and giving us your feedback. If you have any ideas of webinars you'd like to see in the future for EMAC to do, please let us know. And with that, we'll end the webinar. Thank you very much.